Okay, so here is a outline for this chapter. Again, we're going to be going over those definitions for unemployment, employment, the workforce, participation. We're going to look at some of that data and see what the patterns of unemployment look like, and then we'll look at unemployment over the short run and unemployment over the long run. Okay, so if you remember here, this slide, we had this robotic arm that was illustrating the point that human labor in this bread factory was replaced by automated labor, in this case, a robot, due to technological progress. Again, highlighting that difference between those two primary types of technological innovation that we're going to discuss. One is one in which labor becomes more productive, and therefore the demand for labor increases. There's a whole other type of technological innovation which makes labor in some jobs obsolete, like in this case, labor that's packaging bread into pallets. This technological innovation would create a robotic arm that can do that work at a much higher rate or more efficiently or more cheaply. And so this chapter is going to be touching on that concept of those two different types of technological innovation. Okay, so this slide's a little tricky because I can't get the Cameo box to like not cover definitions, but that's totally fine. Here, again, we're going to break up the adult population into employed, unemployed, or out of the labor force. So these are the people that are not participating. And we could also call them not in the labor force as well. But the labor force is made up of these two components here, the employed people plus the unemployed. And then the unemployment rate is essentially the portion of the unemployed people over the labor force. So again, if we've got a definition of the working age population here, all right, we can see that the working age population is made up of two groups. It's made up of non-participants and it's made up of participants as well. All right. And the participants are made up of the employed plus unemployed. And those are also, if you're participating, you are part of the labor force. Okay. And then lastly, again, the unemployment rate is essentially the portion of the unemployed or the number of unemployed as a fraction of the labor force. Or in other words, the number of you, unemployed people, over the number of you plus the number of E, the unemployed plus the employed people. Okay, so here is some data on the actual magnitudes of employed versus unemployed versus non-participants. So you can see here that the biggest piece of the pie in the population is the employed, 155,000, 175,000. The labor force non-participants is close to 100,000. And then the unemployed make up about 6,877,000 people, or 6,877,000, if we want to read it that way. Okay, so this discussion question was going to say, I think it, if I remember correctly, it asks, all right, what is the unemployment rate? And so we're going to use that data that's provided by the provided by that pie to write our unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate in this case, again, given the data that we have, is going to be equal to the number of unemployed, which is 6,877,000 multiplied by 1,000. And we're going to divide it by the employed plus the unemployed. So this is going to be divided by the same number, 6,877,000 people unemployed, plus the employed people, which is 155,175 times 1,000. Like I mentioned before, we can actually if you notice, there's a 1,000 multiplying all these values, so we can actually end up canceling that 1,000 out, and you just end up with that sum there, whatever it might be. We can leave that answer as is on an exam. In fact, I kind of recommend that you do that just so that you're not making any mathematical errors that might cost you points. All right, so this is a slide on hidden unemployment that we talked about, because the unemployment that we are uh, referring to doesn't always capture all unemployment. So here we can have part-time or temporary workers that wish they were full-time or permanent workers. So they're technically considered employed, but they're not employed in the situation that they fully want to be in. We have some people who could be underemployed. These are individuals who are in a job that is way below their skill level. And lastly, we have some discouraged workers, right? So part of the non-participants are these people who are discouraged, who, you know, uh, if the economy was doing good, or if they had more opportunities available to them that they felt confident about, they might be encouraged and they would be participating, and they would then be in the labor market or in the labor force. But because they're not participating, these are individuals who are out of the labor force. They're discouraged workers. They don't really count towards the unemployment rate, because if you remember, the unemployment rate is made up of U divided by U plus E. And in both of those categories, everyone's participating. Okay, so this slide brings us to the labor force participation rate. So this isn't um, the same as the unemployment rate, obviously, it's something different, but it does help to get measurement of how well the labor market is performing. As I mentioned, we do like to combine the labor force participation rate along with the unemployment rate to get a really good assessment of how efficient the labor market is. Right. So this is the percentage of adults in an economy who are either employed or who are unemployed and looking for a job. But um, this is also going to take into consideration that we're going to take the employed and unemployed, and we're going to divide it by the total working age population, which is going to include the employed, the unemployed, and the non-participants as well. And we're going to go ahead and multiply that by 100 if we want to put it into percentage terms. Okay. So here, the discussion question is, using the November 2021 statistics, what is the labor force participation rate? I'll go ahead and refer you to your notes. Maybe you can try this on your own again without without me helping, and see if you remember how to actually use this formula. So give that a try. Maybe you can pause this slideshow and give it a try in your own time. Here's a picture of the historical data of the unemployment rate. You can see that we're going from 1948 to 2020. And like I mentioned in class, this is not a very stable piece of data. This is pretty volatile, but it does have a couple of characteristics that we pointed out to. One is that it never goes down to zero. There's a handful of reasons why. And the other is, if we were to try to average this out, let's say if we were to try to draw a line in the middle of this data, it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 5%. And that's the unemployment rate that we call the natural rate of unemployment. It's the unemployment rate that the economy is always tending towards. And later on in the slideshow, we'll discuss why there is always going to be a positive amount of unemployment. We're never going to get this data down to zero, right? So here, like it's mentioned in the slide here, it always returns to a range of between 4% and 6%, right? And during recessions, we see spikes in unemployment. And when the economy does really well, we see those unemployment rate comes down a lot. Okay, so here again, these are our demographic slides. So here, if you remember in the lecture, we split the unemployment rate amongst by gender, and it's male and female. And the thing that I wanted to draw your attention to was around the split that happened around this point here in 1980, 1985, where before 1980, you can see that the male unemployment rate, the dotted line here, is systematically lower than the female unemployment rate. But following 1980 and 1985, we see that things shifted. Now it's that the female unemployment rate is systematically lower than the male unemployment rate for all sorts of interesting sociological reasons. If we take a look at the unemployment rate for females by age, we can see it becomes quite clear that there is definite differences in age cohorts where the younger group, 16 to 19 years of age, have the systematically higher rate of unemployment. Younger people in this category are just not as connected to the labor force as established females that are 55 and over that are working. You can see that a lot of these individuals might be working temporary jobs. There's going to be obligations such as going to school, try to finish college, and then so they're going to be in and out of the labor force or employment a lot. Whereas you can see if people become more and more established and more involved in their career, more experienced, and as a result, more attached to their job, to their career, they're going to face lower and lower levels of unemployment. So you can see that as one ages, statistically, they're going to face a lower rate of unemployment over time. Here we have unemployment rates by race and ethnicity, and your textbook split this up into white, Hispanic, and black. So again, what we talked about in class was going back to earlier periods due to most likely systemic discriminatory practices and other reasons. We can see that there's a lot of gaps here where minorities faced higher rates of unemployment over their white counterparts. But as I pointed, the good news is that as time has gone by more towards the present, we can see that that gap has shrunk over time. And following 2020, we're in 2025 now with 5 more years worth of data. It would be interesting to see if this gap has gotten even smaller. And here, this slide was a discussion when we talked about comparing unemployment rate from one country to the next, something that we might want to keep or something that we might want to have as a caution is that we have to take a really close look at how labor markets differ from one country to the next. So there could be different definitions of unemployment. There could be a lack of resources in the federal agencies or the government agencies which keep track of the statistics of unemployment. So that could pose a problem if we're looking at how granular some data is. And we can see that culturally, some low-income countries have different types of labor markets than more developed nations. In low-income countries, you can have individuals who aren't paid on a regular salary basis, but they might be involved in more gig type work where it's short term. It could be more subsistence activities and barter, such as if somebody's a carpenter and somebody else is a tailor, they could exchange or barter their services where the tailor might need the carpenter to come over and do some work on their home while the carpenter might need some clothes tailored. And so they might barter their services that way. Both of them in a type of contract, but wouldn't show up in the data at all. So again, when you're looking at international comparisons of labor markets, a couple things to keep in mind. All right, this slide, the new slide here, because the others were review, but this is, not all unemployment is the same. We're going to split unemployment into different categories, but the first one, the one that people pay attention to a lot is something called cyclical unemployment. So this is the type of unemployment or the unemployment that is due to the ups and downs of the economy. So the economy going into recession, coming out of a recession, largely due to the business cycle. That's a word that we've heard before. There's unemployment that follows the business cycle, and this is what we call cyclical unemployment, right? So if we're going to go back to the supply and demand model of the labor market, trying to incorporate unemployment is a little bit tricky because you remember the wage would adjust, uh, move up or down in order to get rid of surpluses or shortages in the labor market. And so, where are you going to have unemployment show up in a theoretical model of the world where, things instantaneously change on paper? Reality is a little bit more messy, and that's something we're going to look at. Okay, so here is a picture of the labor market that we've seen a number of times before. We got the wage on the y-axis, and we have the quantity of labor or employment on the x-axis. We have an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. So in a world where there's flexible wages, if we've got, so let me go ahead and draw you a picture. So again, if we're in this ideal, oh, am I out of ink here? Try to get another pen. Okay, so if we're in a world where wages are flexible, so we'll stick with the Q and W notation here. So wage, we've got demand and supply, and where they intersect is our equilibrium and our employment level, or the quantity of initial labor. So here you can see there is no shortage and there's no surplus. So where is unemployment going to fit in this model? Because if there's no surpluses and there's no shortages of labor, then that means that anybody who wants a job has one, right? So this is kind of a bit of a puzzle here as to how we're going to try to explain unemployment in this model. So um, textbook's going to go through um, couple of theories or a couple of explanations as to how and why we're going to throw unemployment into the mix here. So one explanation is that the wages are sticky in the labor market, meaning that one of the assumptions we made was that the wage will move up and down in order to clear out surpluses and shortages. So what if that's not true? What if wages don't really want to move up and move down? I mean, who wants to accept lower wages? So people might fight against that. Employers might not want to decrease wages. So if wages are sticky, especially if they're sticky going down, you can see that that could result in unemployment. So here on this picture, we can see that if the wage is stuck over here at this high level of W, and that's the current wage, and let's say this is the equilibrium wage that would come out of the model if the wages were not sticky. You can see if it's stuck up here, we have a gap, right? Where this is the quantity of labor supplied at that wage, and this is the quantity of labor demanded. So you can see here at the bottom, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and that is where we get unemployment. So that is going back to the picture that we drew. Let's say this is the equilibrium wage that would show up, but if wages are sticky here, or they're stuck there, let's put W, and I'll put a kind of a tilde there to indicate a sticky wage. And you can see that if we draw that line across, right, we're going to end up with a gap here. This is going to be a surplus, right? And that surplus of labor is where we're actually going to get, that's our unemployment right there, right? By definition, that's people who are trying to supply their labor, but there aren't enough jobs to go around. And that's one explanation is, again, this concept of sticky wages in the labor market. Right. So if the model says that if we have sticky wages, that might provide a source for unemployment, one of the questions we might want to ask is, well, why would wages be sticky in the downward direction? So there's a handful of theories on the next couple of slides. This first one's called the implicit contract theory. This is sort of an invisible handshake or an unwritten agreement between employers and employees that you know they've come to this really interesting equilibrium where the employer, when the economy is doing bad, is going to try and keep wages from falling, and then when the economy is doing really, really well, the employees then aren't going to um, jump and say, well, you need to pay us more. So it's kind of an unwritten agreement that said, employer says, hey, I'll keep your wages from falling when the economy goes in the dumps. If you don't expect me to raise the wage when the economy is doing really, really well. So this is a quid pro quo situation. There's also the efficiency wage theory, which says that if an employer provides a higher wage, then maybe a higher wage than the equilibrium wage, then the efficiency of workers or the productivity of workers will go up. I think this was also used by Henry Ford in the Model T factories, where he said, well, if the equilibrium wage is, let's say, $10 an hour, I'm going to pay my employees $20 an hour. So I'm going to pay them double of what the efficient or the equilibrium wage should be. The idea there is that managers can't monitor their employees 100% of the time. So employees might see that the manager's walking around and they might be productive. And then when the manager takes a turn and goes around the corner, they might then slack off. But if the wage that they're getting paid is way above the equilibrium wage, then getting caught shirking on the job becomes a very expensive proposition, because if you get laid off from a wonderful job at the Model T factory, where are you going to find another job that's going to pay you double what the equilibrium wage is? So the efficiency wage theory does have a historical context where it was used in practice successfully in the Ford Corporation. There is the adverse selection of wage cuts argument, which says that if the employer has to lower wages for everybody, and they're going to lower wages for um, everybody equally, well, not all of your workers are the same. And what's going to happen is that the workers that are, maybe not so productive, they're not going to be as personally offended. But the workers that are super productive, your superstars, would be very upset if they face the equal wage reduction that their less productive counterparts also face. Like, why are you cutting my wages the same as this person's here? I work so much harder. I'm better at the job. So, in order for the employer to avoid that controversy, they kind of keep wages from getting cut altogether, and that keeps wages sticky downward. Couple of other less popular explanations: the insider-outsider model and the relative wage coordination argument. That's a mouthful. I think the name of the definition is almost as long as the definition here. So the insider-outsider model says people that are tenured in the firm, they're called insiders. They're already in there, and they know the procedures inside and out. And other workers are outsiders who might be brand new or prospective hires. But again, how are you going to decide how to cut the wages of everybody? Are these insiders as productive as the outsiders? Maybe their education is, especially in tech, where you might want to look at hiring people fresh out of college. So it's really difficult to balance the productivity levels between people in this insider-outsider model, especially in the application of technology or the tech sector. These people might have a lot of experience, they're insiders, but maybe they don't know the newest computer programming languages, which are what outsiders might have. So it becomes a difficult balancing act there. The relative wage coordination argument says making an across the board wage cut when the economy goes into a recession is pretty difficult. And you face a little bit of friction from workers, because they'll go on strike or they might be more likely to unionize, meaning they're going to join forces. And if you lower one of their wages, they're all going to walk off the job. So interesting historical um, application of this, not just with respect to wage decreases, but also working conditions as well. And so this one's highlights some historical difficulties to trying to lower the wage or to try to make working conditions less hospitable to workers. Here, let's look at panel A here. We can see that when there's an increase in the demand for labor, right, that's going to create this shortage and wages are going to rise until we reach the new equilibrium. So here, wages don't tend to be sticky in the upward direction because who doesn't want to accept a higher wage? So if the labor market model wants to raise wages up, then no one's going to have a problem with that, and you're going to see the equilibrium go up, and we have um, that new equilibrium where there's a higher level of employment at higher wages. However, in panel B, we can see that in the opposite case, where let's say the demand for labor falls now back to D1, we can see that if the wage is up here at W0 and it's sticky in the downward direction, that is going to create this surplus that we saw earlier on. So again, this is where we get this unemployment that would show up in this labor supply, labor demand model. So falling demand for labor with sticky wages results in unemployment. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's other types of unemployment. So let's maybe write down a couple of notes here. So unemployment is going to be broken, and this is what the slide's going to talk about. So when we talk about unemployment, so right, we're going to have it's made up of cyclical. We already talked about that. We have cyclical unemployment, and now we've got these new other types of unemployment. One is frictional unemployment, and the other is structural unemployment. Okay. And these two components here, if you remember back on the slide where we talked about the 5% average unemployment rate, these two here make up the natural rate of unemployment. Oops, I'm nearly off the page. Okay, so on the slide, let's take a look at each one of these. So first off, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that would exist in a growing and healthy economy from the combination of economic, social, and political factors that exist at any given time. So we can't get around it. It is made up of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So frictional is the one I told you where is not necessarily a bad thing. Frictional unemployment could arise because someone might get a better job offer when the economy is doing really, really well. And so when they leave one job and go into the next one, they're categorized as unemployed, right? But if that moving from one job to the next puts them in a better fit, that's going to be better for the economy. And so that's actually better for the economy, but it does result in some small short-term temporary unemployment. So frictional unemployment is the unemployment that occurs as workers move between jobs. Structural unemployment is a little bit more nefarious. This is the one that rises out of workers becoming more obsolete. So let's say, for example, that picture in the beginning of the lecture we looked at with the robot and the bread, the person who used to work that bread line or who used to work in putting bread in those pallets, with the automation that occurred, that would be an example of structural unemployment. It's just unemployment that occurs because individuals don't really have the skills that are valued by employers, especially in an environment where their skills can be easily automated. Right? So these people end up in this category of structural unemployment. They become part of the, um, you know, permanent almost like long-term permanent unemployment. It's really hard to get out of this unless like you go back to school and get a new degree or you go and change your career altogether. All right, so this one's a little bit difficult to get around. And we try to minimize this by providing things like vocational rehab. So if somebody was a blue collar worker and maybe they fell down and got hurt at work, so now they're, let's say, paralyzed or something like that, they can't do their job anymore. We might want to send those people to school to get a degree so that they can at least be marketable on the labor market, maybe not as a blue collar worker, but maybe they can work as a computer scientist or an architect or something maybe related to their former job, right? Um, we consider the economy to be at, so this got cut off by my cameo here, but we consider the economy to be at full employment when the actual unemployment rate that we see is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. So the uh, labor market is at an equilibrium, or the economy is at full employment. So that's worth writing down. When unemployment rate equals, and we can symbolize this with a UN, the natural rate of unemployment, right? If we want to just put like an N in the superscript position, and we'll know that that's natural unemployment, right? And what's natural unemployment made up of again? Made up of the frictional unemployment plus the structural unemployment. That's the natural rate of unemployment. Right? A little more figures to look at. So here, this slide is going to concentrate on panel A. So here is a situation where productivity is continually rising, but then it stops rising. So if we're going through a productivity boom, let's say we have like a technological innovation which increases the productivity of workers, but these things aren't permanent. Sometimes the technological booms they bring the economy up, but then it goes away eventually once that new technology catches on. So we have a picture here of the demand curve for labor shifting out over time as illustrated by um, or as a result of this technological innovation that results in higher levels of productivity. So productivity increases, makes workers more productive, and it increases the demand for workers. That's going to shift the demand curve out to the right. And we could see that at D0, we were at W0, or wage zero. At D1, the equilibrium wage is W1. At D2, the equilibrium wage is W2, right? So workers and employers continue to believe that the wage is going to rise as a result of this because they don't really understand how productivity rises can be temporary. So these wages, there's going to be an expectation that the wages are going to continue rising. And if the productivity boom stops happening, so we end up at D2 and we don't rise up further to D3 or D4, but the wages do, you can see that as the wages rise up without the corresponding increase in the demand for labor, that will also result in unemployment. Because with higher wages, you're going to get the quantity of labor supplied greater than the quantity of labor demanded at these higher rates of salary and wage. Here on panel B now, we can see that if, once productivity hasn't moved a lot in panel A and we've settled back to the correct equilibrium, maybe then all of a sudden there is, a new technological innovation that happens again, and this cycle repeats itself all over again. So here, productivity hasn't changed for some time, or there's been the rate of productivity increase has been zero for some time. We've settled at the equilibrium where maybe unemployment has is going back down towards the equilibrium. Then all of a sudden we get this rightward shift of the demand curve because there's a new technological discovery that's going to once again cause this shortage of labor, and then we're going to get a decrease in the unemployment rate. So we can get these increases in unemployment that come as a result of the wake of productivity rises, and then we can get unemployment rate falling as a result of, again, the productivity rises happening after some time. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some policy now. So for the supply side, we can implement policies like unemployment insurance or unemployment benefits. We can have welfare, food stamps, other government medical benefits like Medicaid or free healthcare, things like that. Some people might see that as, well, if the government's paying me unemployment insurance when I'm not working, if I get welfare benefits and food stamps, which give me, free housing, free food, and let's say free healthcare, then what is the incentive for me to go out and get a job when I lose my job? So those policies might make the opportunity cost of unemployment lower. And so a worker might be less eager to seek a new job. They might not need or feel the need to participate in the labor market if um, the result is they get unemployment insurance and all these other benefits from the government. This might not be a very motivated individual. And if that's the case, you might have a hard time trying to incentivize someone like that to go out and get a job. Right? What economists have found is what seems to really draw the line there, differentiate between if someone pulls the trigger and wants to go out and get that job or not, seems to be how long the assistance is put into place. There are short-term benefits versus long-term benefits. And if all benefits end up being long-term benefits, the cost of that is, the benefit obviously is that people won't be out on the street without any means of providing for themselves. But the cost of that for society is that you're going to get a lot of people who aren't going to want to get out and get that job immediately. Other ways of encouraging people to get back to sooner might be policies and agencies which try to encourage people to go back to work, either for retraining if they face the possibility of that structural unemployment, or if you know there's things that we can do to try to get people to search for work by maybe government can provide support to businesses if they're going to be hiring uh, certain groups of people, like let's say veterans coming back from wars overseas. They could provide benefits for people like that to apply and get a job, and so that's going to incentivize these people to get back to work sooner as well. Now, on the demand side, we could have different policies that might impact the demand curve, which is summarizing the effect of the willingness of firms to hire people. So again, don't forget, this is what the demand for labor is representing, is the firms that are hiring people. So there could be government rules, social institutions, presence of unions. So government rules might make it such that we could put a limit on the number of um, patients that a registered nurse might be able to deal with at one time. So if that number is pretty low, you're going to have the need to hire more nurses if you've got more patients that need to be seen. So certain types of government rules could work one way or the other. We could lower it. We could say, well, it used to be the case that you couldn't have a nurse work and have more than, let's say, 10 patients, but now we might raise it to 20. And if that's the case, we might have a decrease in the demand for nurses because we might not need as many of them because of this government rule change. There could be unions that also can impact the willingness of firms to hire, because when there's different types of industries that are highly unionized, they will usually have to pay a slightly higher wage than what is the equilibrium in that case. And so this would create less of an incentive for firms to hire somebody, because they're going to have to pay them a wage that's a little bit higher than what they would absent the union. And so that could result in higher rates of unemployment as well. And more issues facing, again, to follow up on the last slide about things, or the last couple of slides about things that could impact the natural rate of unemployment. So in more recent years, we can have changes in social, economic, and political factors, which also lead to changes in the natural rate of unemployment as these things change over time. Um, so, again, the natural rate of unemployment, 4.5 to 5.5%, which has been a little bit lower than previously estimated in, back in the 80s, even in some cases the 90s. Natural rate of unemployment was a little bit higher. There have been a couple of reasons for that. One is that we now have the internet, where you can apply for a job through the internet. Before the internet was around, you actually had to go to a job, fill out an application, submit the application to somebody in HR at the job. They would have to read through your application, maybe interview you, and it would take a long time to get that job offer. But now with the internet, you can apply to any number of jobs around the country uh, with the click of a mouse, really. And so that has really brought employers and employees closer together. There's been a growth of the temporary worker industry, and this was largely as a result of the great financial crisis. We saw a lot of this gig economy that started blossoming, where DoorDash, that type of work, Uber, right? So technological innovation, which has created this temporary worker industry. Um, so again, probably lowered the natural rate of unemployment, but I'm guessing has increased the rate of underemployment. If you remember what that means, workers that are in part-time work that which they were in full-time work. So there's probably going to be a lot of that here. So take this one here with a not a grain of salt, but there's two sides to this one here. The aging of the baby boom generation. So again, when these older individuals start to leave the labor market, okay, that is going to lower the unemployment rate as well. And so this is a large demographic shift, which would result in a lower rate of unemployment. Okay, and that is the entire lecture. I will be putting up a to-do list for you, so please keep your eyes peeled for that. And we'll talk to you next week, right? Don't forget, no class this Thursday. I've got that procedure scheduled, and we'll see you all Tuesday of next week. Okay.